I've never been black enough and I've never been white enough. I was not white enough for the whites and not black enough for the blacks. So I felt like I not only lived through the civil rights, I lived through, I guess you could say, my rights too, of having to try to prove myself as a kid. After I got to an adult, way past, I finally got over it and said, I am what I am. And that's it. God made me who I am.
Cinderella Williams grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. She was a member of the T.Y. Rogers Community Choir. That choir would play an important role in the civil rights movement. Cinderella Williams remembers her grandfather's barber shop, her uncle's African American newspaper, and the bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church.
So the bombing of 16th Street, my aunt belonged to 16th Street, and I can remember going there several times for Sunday school. So I was right in the, I guess you could say, the thick of things when it came to civil rights, but my understanding was here and there.
Krispy Kreme donuts were famous throughout the South. Jim Crow would deny African Americans their civil rights and the right to vote, but who would ever think Jim Crow would also deny them donuts?
My dad was the type who took us on Sundays for long drives, family drives, and we would always go to Krispy Kreme donut place. We weren't allowed to eat the donuts, but we were only allowed to buy the holes. But to us, that was normal. It was the norm. And it was just a Sunday drive with donut holes. As blacks, we had to go to the back of everything. And so I guess they considered, as they did certain foods back then, that the donuts were for the elite, and the leftovers, which they figured were the holes, were for the coloreds, as they said. So we had the holes. And we would also go to Pure Process, which was located on River Road, was an ice cream place. And we also had to go to the back door there.
Growing up in a segregated world, people remember the first time they encountered the harsh reality of Jim Crow.
When I first remember being treated differently was when we were allowed to go in the front door. My friends and I rode our bicycles down to Pure Process and went in that front door. And as we were in there getting ready to place our order, a white man came in, and they asked us to step aside to wait on him first. And I think that was my first acknowledgement of saying, oh, we're different.
She never forgot Pure Process, and she would always remember the lunch counter at Woolworth's department store.
But there's one thing that stuck in my mind, which is Woolworth's, and I will never forget it, downtown. And that was before I knew about the kids who went and sat at the counter or anything. I wasn't even aware of that. I knew that as a black child, I couldn't go in there and eat. So we would go, and I would look in that window at all those white people sitting at their counter eating, and I swore one day I would eat at that counter. And those kids who went there and sat and made that difference made that possible, so that one day I could sit at that counter, and I finally did.
In the days of Jim Crow, everything was segregated: lunch counters, schools, and even the newspapers. Cinderella's uncle owned an African American newspaper, the Birmingham Times.
My uncle's name was Jesse Lewis, Sr., and his newspaper was the Birmingham Times. He wasn't fortunate enough to own a printing press, and so the only people who owned a printing press were the whites, of course, and they would not print for a black-owned newspaper. So therefore, he had to find someone who print. My dad always was very knowledgeable, very knowledgeable. He didn't know everything, but he knew a little bit about everything. And so he did find a place in Northport to print it. So I would ride with my daddy to a place in Northport, and he would have the papers printed there, and we'd put them on the Greyhound bus and send them to my uncle. I really was kind of young and really didn't understand. Uh, all I knew that I was riding with my dad to pick up the print to put it on the bus to my uncle. I didn't realize the black and white situation that was going on.
While Cinderella grew up in a completely segregated world, if a black person worked for a white person, they were sometimes able to gain access to the privileged white world.
My dad was associated with a lot of whites because he worked for a lot of whites. His mother worked for a lot of whites, and they were fortunate whites. And so thereby he had the wherewithal to know what he always taught us. You may not know everything, but you should know where you can go and get what you need. And so he did. And that made us fortunate enough to be able to do a lot of things that others could not do. My uncle was also the first black who worked on Wallace's cabinet. So he was very fortunate. As I say, I came from a very fortunate family. We didn't have a lot, but we thought we had a lot. My uncle always entertained Jackie Robinson and people of the sort. So he had later on had stock in Coca-Cola. He had the first black bowling alley in Birmingham. I can remember people, Oscar Adams, who was a judge, was at his house all the time. My aunt even tried to get me to be friends with the popular Angela Davis, but I rebelled. I was very rebellious, and I didn't want to be her friend. So I just wanted to play, and she was a little bit older than me, and I think she was doing things I didn't understand at the time.
The church was the heartbeat of the civil rights movement. The music was the heartbeat of the church. Music was often seen as joyous and uplifting, but during the civil rights movement, it could be dangerous.
Olivia was she was everything to us. She was the choir director, she was the piano player, she was our mama, our daddy, our grandmama, our everything. When she thought we were not singing those songs right, I never will forget. She would hit down that piano, bam, and she would say, "Sing the song." And then she would talk about us and make us mad. And then she'd say, "You mad? Good. Now you can sing." And then she started playing that piano, and we would really sing. really sing.
Even though they didn't realize it at the time, being a part of the choir would give these young people the chance to be a part of history.
I was in the T.Y. Rogers Memorial Choir. Everyone wanted T.Y. to come and preach for them or to be present at some type of ribbon cutting, anything. So if he was going to be there, of course his choir had to be there. I remember, of course, John Bird being our lead song, our lead, soloist, and Jimmy Hardaway playing the organ for us. He loved to play the organ. He really didn't like playing the piano. And some of the songs, I remember singing songs about T.Y., after he had gotten killed. And sometimes we say been killed because we weren't sure as his members of the church and just personal friends of his, our leader. He was actually our Martin Luther King Jr. We felt like he came to save us after Martin Luther was killed. And then to have him killed, it just really did something to us. So yes, Jimmy and John got together, and I don't know who else, and they wrote a song about him. So we sung those songs. We sung songs about, God, and I just can't think of Telephone to Glory. I remember that one. That was one of my favorites. And his line is never busy. And I keep that with me now to stay focused on my Christianity.
The choir traveled. Wherever the movement needed them, they would be there.
I can remember us going to different places, and when I say that, I mean churches that were in rural areas where the driver had to really drive off. They thought the Klan was after us. They thought the police were after us. Not really being caught up in it because we were kids. We kind of would laugh at it sometimes, not knowing the seriousness of it. You think back now and you think, God, I could have died, if it hadn't been for the Lord on my side. I can remember my Sunday school teacher, Mr. George Crummy, who I didn't understand was my Sunday school teacher throughout my time at First African, even into my college days. And I understand it now because he was kind of our protector. He drove the car for the choir members. And as we drove, he kept us protected, us kids. He really didn't talk about civil rights. He talked about things that kept us, our minds off the worst part of what was going on. And he drove diligently. And I can remember him basically driving the getaway car, I guess you could say, to some of these places. I remember going to these places and having to wait for hours before we could leave or before we could enter, or we were given instructions to get down on the floor. And we would get down on the floor to enter some of these places. And being that we traveled to Mississippi, which at that time was very dangerous, very dangerous. We didn't understand the danger, just how dangerous it was.
While there was danger and there was fear, the songs were a comfort, a cure for the fear.
We did a lot of singing all the way to Mississippi, singing all the way back, but that was like after the fact. Someone would either break out with a song, and so we would follow. And sometimes we would cry. I think because it just sat down in us, so knowing that what we had just gone through and thinking about we could have been killed and not really understanding why. Not knowing why, I think, is the worst thing than knowing. I think if we had known and understood, we may have been a little better off than just being, in deep thought of why. Just why? Because we could not understand why. As kids, and how do you explain that to kids? I do remember once John Bird was driving the car and we had a blowout, and for some reason, we always had to get everywhere we went in a hurry. So we were always like maybe doing 90 to 100 as we traveled. That just seemed to be the norm. And being on the side of the road to change a flat in those times was more dangerous than we realized, because we were already shouldn't have been out at night. Black people didn't go out at night because it was during the time that the Klans could find you, or any whites would come up on you and kill you, and no one would ever see you again. I never will forget that. We were really, really scared as kids because we didn't know, they told us they can kill us, they can kill us. We didn't know why they wanted to kill us, just for the color of our skin. We didn't understand that.
In 1954, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, made separate but equal illegal in the schools. Schools would, by law, be ordered to integrate. Several years later, when integration finally arrived in Tuscaloosa, Cinderella would be one of the first students to integrate the all-white schools.
I was one of 3 blacks who integrated Verna Elementary. The entire school, before we came, the 3 black girls, they were called to an assembly, and they were talked to by the principal and vice principal about us coming, and they were told not to call us the N-word. My dad and my mom both worked early morning till late night, so a cab driver, my daddy hired him, Mr. Davis, I never will forget him. He drove me to Verna every day and picked me up and took me home to a babysitter every evening. And while there, I experienced what I would say really knowing I was black. There was a girl, Laura, I want to say Hibbert. She was a Hibbert or Hubbard, but she was related to Jack Warner. And she came to school in a limousine every day. And she called me a pick ninny. I didn't even know what a pick ninny was. So I went home to tell my mom about it, and she told me what a pick ninny was. And she just said, when you go back, you tell her that she came from Tobacco Road. Well, I didn't know what Tobacco Road was. So she explained that to me. So I thought I had ammo. And I went back to school and I told her, told her she came from Tobacco Road, and she got really mad at me and we fought. I think it was the first fight they probably ever had at a white school before was between me and Laura. And after that, like kids, we became the best friends. She even, after we got older, she even came to my house.
Cinderella integrated the Tuscaloosa public elementary schools. When it was time to go to high school, she decided to go to Druid City High, a historically all-black school. Little did she know, a skirt that was too short for her teacher's approval would send Cinderella back across the tracks to the historically all-white school, Tuscaloosa High.
When I was in high school, at Druid High School, the black high school, I was in Mrs. Hughes, was her name, homeroom class. And in those times, you were not allowed to wear short skirts. She took it upon herself, Mrs. Hughes did, to have a yardstick. And she measured girls' skirts by the yardsticks. And I have always been outspoken. So that morning, and my mother dressed me conservatively, I came to school and she stood up. And I think it was because it wasn't the first encounter I had. And I think that's what probably made me answer the way I did or react the way I did, is because everybody seemed, all the teachers when I were in their class and they knew my mother, they tend to make me or make an example out of me. And so that morning she made me come up in front of everybody in the classroom. She measured my skirt and she told me my skirt was too short. And then my mouth opened. And I said to her, "You're not my mother and you don't buy my clothes," which was very defiant, disobedient, and not heard of in that day. So she immediately took me to the principal's office, which was her husband, which was next door to my mother's office, being the bookkeeper. And both were out of their offices. But just so happened, and luckily on my side, my mother came back and passed by and and she said, "What are you doing in here?" And she said, "Get up." And she took me home and she told my dad, she said, "This girl has to go because I need my job. Get her over in Tuscaloosa High." And so to be very specific about it, my dad and mother moved into an apartment because there was zoning during that time. And I was actually zoned for Druid because at that time we had moved out of the house and lived in with my grandmother. So they rented an apartment, which was right down the street from Tuscaloosa High. We called T-High, and that's how I got to T-High.
In high school, not only would Cinderella have to learn the curriculum, she would also have to learn the color of her skin and how it made her different.
The tracks across 15th Street determined whether you were white or black. The blacks lived on the west side of the tracks, and the whites lived on the east side of the tracks. And so Tuscaloosa High was known as the white school, but it had integrated. And I remember going there for the first time and sitting in my homeroom class. And the teacher, I don't remember her name now, coming to me, and she bent down as to get on my level. And she said, "What do you go for?" And I didn't understand what she meant. That term to me meant, what do you go for means, what do you like to eat? Because I like to eat, as you could tell. And I did even then. And so I said, "Oh, I like milkshakes and hamburgers." And she looked at me and she said, "No, what do you go for?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "Black or white." And that was my moment then. And I thought to myself, all these years, everybody knew that I was black. But coming at that period of time in integration, now they decide that I have to be something other than black. And from that point on, I continued to get that question all through college. that the kids would come and ask me if we had to be in a group. They would say, "Who in your family is white?" They didn't ask me what I went for or what. They just said, "Who in your family is white?" And of course, I would tell them, my grandfather. And they said, I knew it was somebody. And they would see my mother, and then they would say, "Oh, okay."
Color was an issue, even when it came time to get a driver's license.
I can even remember an incident in Greensboro. I lived in outside of Akron, and I had to go and renew my license. And when I went to get my license, I came back, and I think it was a week or so later, someone asked me for my license, and they looked up at me, and they said, "Did you know you have your eyes as brown?" And I was furious. So I went back, and I made the lady change them. I said, "Look at me. Are my eyes brown?" And she said, "No." And I said, "What color are they?" She said, "Hazel." I said, "Okay, then that's what I want on there." "Well, we don't do hazel." I said, "Well, green." And so I made them look. I said, "That's why if I did a crime, you couldn't catch me and prove it was me." So, but like I said, from then on, I knew that I was in a period that that would continue forever, and it has most of my life. I remember at First African, they asked me to do speak for Black History, and I did. Miss Stringfellow actually asked, and I did. And I think the title or whatever it was "When Do I Get Black Enough?" And I've never been black enough, and I've never been white enough. I was not white enough for the whites and not black enough for the blacks. So I felt like I not only lived through the civil rights, I lived through, I guess you could say, my rights too, of having to try to prove myself as a kid. After I got to an adult, way past, I finally got over it and said, I am what I am. And that's it. God made me who I am. But I had some times where they really made me feel bad. So I not only felt bad doing the civil rights, I felt bad from my own people as well. And that really did hurt. Really did. I do remember the mass meetings. I do remember the boycotts. I can remember about the boycott with my dad and my mother and some friends who may have been older than I was. And I wanted to attend a lot of things, but my mother wouldn't allow me to because she felt like I was too young to do those things. The mass meetings to my friends and us was, I guess, a time when we could meet up with our friends. We were brought up in a different, brought up different in that era, that grown people had grown people's business and children had children's business. And so our business was to play and be a child. Now, we knew that we had mass meetings and that our parents met there to discuss things, but what? We had no idea, and we really didn't care at the time. We just wanted to play and be kids.
Some of the men had formed a group called the Deacons of Defense. They provided protection for T.Y. Rogers and his family. We asked Cinderella if her father had been a deacon of defense.
I don't ever remember my daddy guard. I remember us, Cora, myself, and a lot of others who stood guard over T.Y. Rogers' body at the church. And my mother came there and snatched, I think, me and Cora both away because she said we were too young to be up there guarding bodies. But she was actually afraid because she didn't know whether they would come in and shoot or, bomb or whatever at that time. So she didn't want us to be in harm's way. So she came and got us out of there. I know that my dad had something to do with the installation and everything when Martin Luther King came to install T.Y. as the pastor, but I don't remember exactly what. My daddy has talked a lot about his involvement as a foot soldier in the civil rights movement because he drove Arthurine Lucy, and he did a lot of other things that I should have written down and everything. But, by the way, he's done a book. This is the book that my dad wrote. It's called The Real Truth, The City of Tuscaloosa, Undressed of Mendacity, Redressed in Veracity. And on the front, he has a picture, and you probably will have to get a copy of the book to be able to zoom in to see it. But it's a picture of him when they took him to jail. When I was talking about them taking him to jail, I've had young people to come to me and say they don't know their history because we don't talk about the history. That when they ask us, older people, I've become the older people now, about the history, is that we don't like to talk about it. And I tell them that we do, but it has to be maybe gently, because it has a lot of memories and all of them are not good. So when you get to people older than me with my dad and thing, it's not a joking matter. It wasn't a way of life. It was something that they were brought into almost like slavery. And so it was something you endured. You trusted God to bring you through, and he did.